talks about immigration from non-Western countries to Western countries. But most of the countries with the highest rates of immigration are in the Middle East. And very few people, except for like one YouTube channel, talks about how immigration and its impact on the Middle East. The Middle East is a very strange place for us Western people. But most of the Middle East population are considered expats. They're not from the Middle East. And most of these people usually come from, for example, this is the Abu Dhabi here, and only 11% of the population in the Middle Eastern states are actually from the United Arab Emirates as well. And today we'll talk about why are these countries accepting massive amounts of immigration. Like, most people don't talk about this country. Like, most of it's, of course, in a Western-oriented world, most people are going to talk about, the Western nations and what's, the immigration to those countries. But there's actually another immigration hotspot that is kind of ignored. Also, Singapore as well receives a lot of immigrants as well. But again, Singapore is a very multicultural and diverse city. But why does the Middle East, particularly the Gulf states, have so much immigration as well, with the exception of Yemen? And we're going over that in this video. So the Middle East, most of these countries have an immigration rate higher than 30%. Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan. Jordan is easily explained by the Syrian crisis. Most people say, the Syrians only went to Europe. They skipped Turkey and Jordan. This is very, very untrue. The most amount of Syrian refugees went to Turkey and Jordan. They took the massive brunt of the Syrian refugees. Also, some went to Lebanon, and some even to Israel, and some to the Gulf states. These were actually the most common places in the world that received immigrants from Syria or refugees. Now we're going to talk about the Arabic Peninsula as well, the Arabian Peninsula. Well, this is mostly because of the discovery of the oil. Considering these places were mostly sparsely populated for most of the time, they needed more people. So, India, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and even people from Western nations, Egypt, as well with Iraq and Syria and Turkey, and East Asia as well, and Africa and the Americas as well. The Arabic-speaking nations have basically become a melting pot of the world, very similar to the US and Canada. Almost no one talks about it. Most of these are mostly male guest workers. There are women who move to these countries, but most of them are male guest workers. But unlike the US and other countries, the immigrants are treated very poorly in this country. They typically make up the lower jobs in these countries. And because of how these countries are, migrants are often treated very poorly in these countries as well. But I think you'd expect you're definitely gonna see cultural changes in these countries. Happen in all of these countries. Not really Jordan, as most of Jordan's immigration comes from refugees from Iraq and Syria. Same thing with Kuwait. But a lot of these countries may see a more cultural tie with India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and Iran and Egypt, along with other Middle Eastern countries. For example, I bet the real religion of Saudi Arabia is probably 80% Muslim and 10% religions from India, and 10% other religions, as Saudi Arabia does accept a lot of Muslim immigrants, but there are probably a lot of Hindu immigrants as well from India, as well, since there are around 4 million immigrants in India as well. This Hinduization of the Arabian Peninsula will likely continue over the coming decades. For example, besides the US, the second largest number of Indians living outside of India is in most of these nations here and Burma and the countries that border India. Yeah, so you can definitely see history taking action as well in this world. If immigration from India and other countries and the culture continues, we'll definitely see these countries basically become more like India than what they used to be as well. It's always fascinating to see what happens to other parts of the world. These Middle Eastern countries have the highest immigration rates in the world, coming from 88% down to 32%. But there are some countries people don't move to: Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, mostly because of the governments of these countries. But I wouldn't be too surprised if Iran starts accepting immigrants from India as well, alongside with places such as like Syria and Turkey as well. Which means with the Western nations, they're going to have to continue competing with the Middle East for immigrants as well. And with immigrants from India, the West is receiving mostly the highest skilled, and the lower skilled are mostly going to the the Arabian Peninsula as well. So that's it about this more shorter video, and yeah, definitely it is something very interesting that most people tend to not talk about. And some other day, I think the next demographic video we'll talk about is the demographic of these nations of South America and the crisis that most people ignore as well. And maybe we make the video about Puerto Rico and its massive demographic crisis as well. Goodbye.